What's up, everybody? Welcome back to John's Fantasy Football Show. I know what you're thinking. Oh, fantasy's over. Why is there a show on? Well, it's our award show. We're going to be giving out the awards for some of the best picks that John had, some of the worst picks John had, some of the best hot streaks that John had this season. You're going to be getting the full coverage of John's season this year from 2021 all the way up until whenever this is 2022, January, the first week or whatever. There's a lot to go through, John. Are you ready to go through this?
I can't wait. I mean, I thank everybody that joined my lives and joined the Patreon and just followed along every week. Some people, honestly, you'll probably be listening to the picks, and some of these picks that I mentioned, you might not know because you weren't following at that point, or some of them you'll know and be like, oh, I saw that one, and that's when I started following you guys. But I just thank you guys for following along every week. Every Sunday was the highlight of my Sunday, just going live and helping you guys win fantasy. So basically just recapping my weekly picks, because I know a lot of you guys are like, well, John, you were pretty right a lot of the time for weekly picks and must sits, but how right were you really? And what were some of the best picks and some of the worst picks? So I'm really excited to just, look back on the season and see how everything went.
Yeah. And, we kind of self-proclaim as to be like the best fantasy football knowledge on TikTok, but it's good to kind of look the results in the face and say, oh, okay, this is where we went wrong. This is where you went right. And overall, it looks really good. I mean, everything is about over 50% in total, which is more than you could ask for. And we're going to compare it to some of the top fantasy football analysts in the US. I mean, in the industry, and it matches right up with them, if not better. So without further ado, we're going to get started with the obvious weekly pick and must sit results. So, John, you went on Excel and you basically broke down all of your picks, and you went through pick 1 to pick 5 when you did rankings for weekly picks and must sits. And it looks like you broke it down between the percentage that you hit on that specific pick, right?
Right. So basically what I did, I took all the stats. I was, I guess, dumb and I didn't think that we would grow as much as we did this season. So I didn't really track weeks 1 and 2. So everything here is just percentages from week 3 to week 18, which is, I think, enough to draw conclusions from. Week 1 and week 2, I didn't really track because we didn't have the Patreon at that point. So I can't go back to see what my picks are because I post my picks every Sunday morning. So I guess I just don't have those. But yeah, from week 3 to week 18, I basically tracked all my picks. And if you guys didn't notice, basically when I go live on Sunday or when I post on the Patreon, my weekly picks and must sits, number 1 weekly pick is my most confident, and then it goes down from there. So my number 1 weekly pick was my best this season, and actually it hit 93.33% of the time. So basically 93% of the time, my number 1 weekly pick overachieved or beat their expectation or their projection for that week. And the average score of my weekly picks were 23.61 fantasy points. So basically, if I say a number 1 weekly pick, basically you have to get them into your lineup, except for the 1 or 2 weeks that I completely missed, which actually was just 1 week that I completely missed. And also for these stats, I do want to mention that if somebody got hurt or somebody didn't play, like if they got hurt in the beginning of the game, then I didn't count those stats toward this. So like one of them, a lot of you guys probably know the Antonio Brown. That one's not tracked in here. And one of them, the Lamar Jackson that I picked as a must sit, but he got hurt in like the first quarter. That's not like any injuries and anomalies like Antonio Brown walking off the field, basically because he was injured. That's left out of these stats.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So even if it was in your favor, like the Lamar Jackson, still leave it off.
Right. So basically that's what pick 1 was. And then the others were around 50%. They weren't anything great, weren't anything too bad. But basically the total of weekly picks, my percentage was 64.91%. So basically 65% of the time, if you just take any one of my weekly picks, there's a 65% chance that they're going to overachieve or beat their expectation. And my weekly picks average 16.51 fantasy points, with the best one obviously being, that number 1 weekly pick is like the best one. And one of the stats is out of the 15 tracked number 1 weekly picks from week 3 to week 18, That's 16 weeks, but subtracting the Antonio Brown week, there's 15 tracked number one weekly picks. 14 out of the 15 scored 16.6 fantasy points or more, which is pretty good. That's not easy to do. And then 9 of the 15 scored more than 24 fantasy points, which is, when you think of 24 fantasy points, that's pretty hard to do. Like, you have to get basically, like, if you get like 8 catches for 80 yards and a touchdown, you're not even at 24 points. So basically, that you have to do better than 8 catches, 80 yards and a touchdown, which is some guys, like, best game of the season. So 9 of the 15 got better than 24 fantasy points. And out of all the 15 tracked number one weekly picks, 13 of them scored a touchdown, which is pretty crazy. Like, I didn't really go into the weekly picks thinking, oh, I'm just going to pick a guy that I really think is going to score a touchdown. I basically go into it and break down the game and think how this game is going to go and how the other team is going to attack this team, and then who's going to be the biggest beneficiary. So it just so happened that 13 out of the 15 tracked number one weekly picks, they scored a touchdown. So anybody that's into betting or anything, it's probably pretty safe to say that either the guy's going to go over their yardage total or be an anytime touchdown scorer that game, or both. So just for the future for you guys. But that was one of my favorite stats is those two, and how much they actually almost all scored a touchdown, which is kind of crazy. If you give me like one guy, okay, who's going to score a touchdown, I pretty much got it right almost every time, or 93% to be exact.
I love during the season, once you had made a lot of picks, and it was probably, week 9 or 10. So people started to get like a feel for your picks. The theme was 3 out of 4. Your weekly picks, you go 3 for 4. So
Yep.
even during the lives, people would be like, all right, like if there's 4 players right there, one of them is going to freaking be a dud.
Statistically, which one of these is not going to be right?
Yeah. So like eventually people weren't even mad that you were getting 3 for 4, because they're like, yep, that's just how it's going to be.
I mean, that's pretty good. If you could join a live, basically like a live like mine, and I show a board and it has 4 people, and like one of them's going to be wrong, that means 3 players are going to be right. Like, that's pretty good, which means like most of the time, like, okay, I just pick any random player, yep, he's going to do really good, which is a pretty big advantage in fantasy.
It is. You just helped narrow down the choices.
Right.
So that was
basically my theme throughout the year was basically, if I say a guy on my weekly picks, like, he's not necessarily like you have to get him into your lineup. Like, I remember Brevin Jordan, like, a lot of those lower tier guys. I said, you don't need to get these guys into your lineup, but if you're deciding between this guy or somebody else, then choose this guy.
Yeah. And the must sits, let's move on to the must sits, because although it wasn't as good, you picked a lot of big name players, which I know some other fantasy analysis, they didn't really pick, big name guys. They would pick lower tier that were going to kind of score lower in the first place. You picked guys like Aaron Rodgers. You picked Michael Pittman, who had big weeks, a lot of big name guys that you were picking for the must sit. So although you were wrong, it looks like the average score was pretty low, even though they beat their projection.
Right. So basically the must sits, to, I guess, give a little idea, total on the must sits, I was 59.26%. So I was still right most of the time for my must sits, and my must sits average 11.99 fantasy points. So significantly less than my weekly picks, which would make sense. So my must sits, I was still right most of the time. And my number one must sit, I usually, like you said, I usually try to pick a big name player. I like my picks to be bold, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but same with my weekly picks and my must sits. I don't want to say guys that like everybody kind of expects to do well. Like if a guy's playing the Detroit Lions, you kind of expect him to already do well. So I'm not really going to try to pick him to be a weekly pick. Or if a guy's going against like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers or like run defense, or like a really good pass defense, I'm not really going to pick them. I'm going to try to pick higher profile players for my must sits and kind of mid guys for the weekly picks. So for the number one must sit, I hit 56.25% of the time, which is close to my average, I guess, at the end. But the average score for my must sits was 10.89 fantasy points. But like I said, I picked big name players like Mike Evans. I picked a couple times, Amari Cooper a couple times as my number one must sit. Zeke I picked once. I picked Michael Pittman twice. Damian Harris twice, DeAndre Hopkins. I had a couple of times as one of my must sits. So I tried to pick higher profile players for that, just so I could be bold and give you guys an idea. Like if I say Mike Evans, obviously he's not a complete must sit, and that's what I talked about towards the end of the season. Is I'm probably going to change my wording next year from must sit to weekly sit, because they're guys that I'm downgrading. Obviously, Mike Evans is not a complete must sit if he's on my board. I'm just saying he's probably a downgrade, and I would play him over guys in the same vicinity or even projected a little bit lower than him. But if you have Mike Evans or you're deciding between him or like Kenny Galladay, obviously you're still starting Evans, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. It's tough with the must sits because even if they get projected, for me at least, that seems like a letdown.
Right.
Even if technically when you pick a must sit, you're saying, oh, he's not going to reach the projection. But a lot of times their projection would be maybe like 15 to 18. And if that's your number one guy and he gets around 15, even though it hit the projection, that's still underwhelming compared to like every other player that you have on your roster. If that's your number one guy, you need him to get like over 20.
Right. And I think a good example of that was one of the weeks I picked Ayuk as one of my weekly picks. He wasn't my number one. I think he was my number 3. And he was projected like 13 points that week, but he only got 12.5. But at that point, he was really struggling. And 12.5 was his best week since like really early in the season. So technically, yeah, I missed on that weekly pick, but a lot of people in the comments were saying, well, yeah, Ayuk, that's pretty solid for Ayuk to get 12.5. Like if you're starting him as a flex guy, like people were like, I'd be happy with that. So like it is kind of a little bit misleading. I try to pick guys, as you guys know, that, you know, haven't been doing good, or their expectation isn't that they're going to have a great game. Like Ayuk, the expectation was that he was going to continue struggling, and he had one of his best weeks in 5 weeks, but he still didn't hit his projection of 13. So I technically missed, but maybe it helps some of you guys out in your flex spot.
Yeah. And as we move down this list, we'll go through totaling everything from weekly picks to must sits. And we're going since week 12. So give us the total percentage of right and wrong picks.
So yeah, so for the whole season, I said the weekly picks was 64.91% correct, and then the must sits was 59.26. So on the season, combining both, I was 62.16% correct. And when you hear that, you're like, that's really not that great. I mean, you're like, I remember you being better than that. No offense, but like 62%. And even when I say it, I'm like, that's like, it's okay. It doesn't seem like that good. But when you think about it, like this was really my first season doing like weekly picks and must sits. Like last season we hit 10K followers on Christmas Eve. So it was like very late in the season. And I think I did like one weekly pick for the first like half of the season, and then maybe added 2, or we didn't even track it, like how well I did.
It was like no more than 3 picks, you
right.
know, no more than 3 that you did that first season.
Right. So this season, I was kind of like in the beginning of the season getting it under my belt. And then, so basically the whole season combined, I was 62.16%. But since week 12, basically you're like, all right, so you got the whole hang of it in the beginning of the season, but how'd you do towards the end of the season? You know, when people are going into the playoffs, that's when people really need advice, you know, who to pick up, who to put in, try to get those wins. So either they don't get punished and get in last place, or that they can get into the playoffs. So when you look at my stats since week 12, my weekly picks were 74.07%. So significantly better than my season average. My must sits were 65.38%, which was significantly better than my average. And then my total since week 12 was 69.81%. So around 70%. So I definitely did get a lot better towards the end of the season, which is probably when you guys were following along. We had less followers in the beginning of the season. So you guys, that's what you guys were more accustomed to, me getting 74% of my weekly picks. So I do get most things right, but like I usually say, I don't get everything right. So it's your guys' call as to who you should start and who you should sit, but I do get most things right. So that was since week 12. I think I picked it up towards the end of the season. And I know, Jared, remember when it was like week 10 or something, and I had gotten like one of my worst weeks of the season. And remember, I was on like a pretty like bad, like losing streak, not pretty bad, but I was maybe around 55%, I would guess. And then I was like, I remember me and you coming on the podcast here, I think, and off camera, we were like, I really need to like pick it up. Like, this is when our followers are going to remember us for next season. This is where we're going to gain more followers and more trust going into the playoffs. So I'm like, I need to get on a streak. Mm-hmm. And that's when week 12, I just started going on a tear. I don't know what happened, but I did some extra research and hopefully help people get into the playoffs. But obviously, with all that, I know I wanted to compare it to somebody else in the fantasy football industry and somebody who's pretty well known and pretty trusted in fantasy football. And that's Matthew Berry. A lot of you probably have heard of him. He works for ESPN, has a fantasy football show. They go on ESPN2 every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. during the football season. And I usually watch them before I go live on my show, but I usually don't make the same picks as them. I do like their insight, and they have some reporters that report on some good things. But I wanted to compare my stats, which was 64.91% for weekly picks and 59.26%. I wanted to compare that. That was a total of 62.16%. I wanted to compare it to Matthew Berry, because what he does is he posts a love-hate, and he picks 5 players that he loves that week, and he picks 5 players that he hates that week, guys that are going to overachieve or guys that are going to underachieve. And he posts that on Instagram. So you guys could go to his Instagram, on Instagram, Matthew Berry, TMR, and you could go and track what I just tracked. It literally took me like 20 minutes last night. I just took his stats from his loves and figured out if the guy beat his projection or not, and then did the same thing for his hates. So you guys could track my picks all year. If you go back either on our Patreon or from our TikTok, you could track mine and you could track Matthew Berry's. And I'm not lying about any of this stuff. I literally just took it right from his Instagram and compiled the stats. So it's completely valid. But basically, Matthew Berry's loves, or his comparable to my weekly picks, he went 33 out of 76, which is 43.42%. And then for his hates, he went 47 out of 69, which is 68.12%. So out of the total, he was 80 out of 145, which is 55.17%. So he's right 55.17% of the time, and I was right basically 62.16% of the time.
How many total picks did you have? What was your ratio for you?
Let me see. I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head, but I'll have to check.
Because you have it from week 12. Because I was looking at Matthew Berry's total, 80 out of 145.
Yeah, his 80 out of 145 was for the entire season. My entire season was 69 out of 111, which is 62.16%. So
because you started off doing just 3 and 3 at first, right?
Right.
So he was doing, I think, 5 loves and 5 hates, I think.
Right. But I mean, yeah, he did take more chances, but at the same time, like, I just went by percentage. Like, yeah, he did make 145 picks, but he got 80 of them right, and I only did 111 picks, but I got 69 right. So my percentage was better. And not saying anything against Matthew Berry. I really do enjoy listening to his podcast and everything, but I just wanted to, share that with you guys, what I found, because as I was going throughout the later parts of the season, I was like, since week 12 especially, I was like, I feel like I'm getting more right than he is, and not that I'm better than him or anything. I'm just saying I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to, bring it up and share that with you guys, just so you guys have some trust in me, because I feel like we are an underrated fantasy account. I mean, we are pretty followed on TikTok, 150,000, but here on YouTube, we only have like 2,000, a little over 2,000 subscribers, and Instagram about 4,000 followers. So I think we are underrated, and I think people should trust us more than they do.
Yeah, it's not about like bragging and saying, oh, Matthew Berry had a terrible year, but it's just comparing to the top of the fantasy world. Right. He really, when you think of fantasy football and you think of the analysts for fantasy football, he's the number one guy.
Right.
So it's good to compare yourself to the top, see where you stack up, see where you rank up. And you did pretty well. I mean, you technically beat him on your weekly picks and must sits. And that's not saying there's so many other picks that you have all in like the Instagram DMs and the Patreon and all those countless ones that you got right that no one's just going to see. They're just all in the DMs.
Right. Like especially the waiver wire. I feel like I did pretty good given waiver wire advice. So basically, an example is like the last week of the season in week 18. I said you have to pick up Kenneth Gainwell, pick up Washington defense, pick up the Washington kicker. Both Washington played the Giants that week, and I said you need to start all these guys, and especially the defense and the kicker, because they averaged so many points against the Giants in the last few weeks. Turns out that went 3 for 3. They all beat their projection. The defense got 21, the kicker got 11, and Kenneth Gainwell got 18.7. But I'm that's not included in these stats, So the things like that, it's just like there's so much other stuff throughout the season that I do get right. And not to say that I get it 100% right, but there's a lot of other stuff that we could have tracked, but just didn't.
Yeah. And, we're just showing this because it's good to look at all the results, but also, like you said, establish the credibility here. Like
and just being honest too. Like if I did bad, like literally my must sits were 59.26. Like, yeah, I got it right most of the time, but in my eyes, I wouldn't consider that good. And I'm going to try to be better next season on my must sits.
Mm-hmm. And, we're going to transition into the next section, which is the award show. You're going to be giving out some awards. One of the ones is your worst pick. So we're going to be addressing it.
Yeah.
Let's transition here. The award show, I wish we came up with a name, but we're just going to do John's award show for now. The first one, best weekly pick, the pick that beat their projection by the biggest percentage. Who was that? Which week was that?
So it was Kadarius Toney. He was the best weekly pick of the season, and it was actually in week 5. Kadarius Toney and the Giants played the Dallas Cowboys. A lot of you know that game. And nobody really knew about Kadarius Toney. And then I came on. He was my number 3 weekly pick. So I guess he was my least confident out of the 3 that I picked that week. But he was still on the board. He was projected 9.37 fantasy points that week. Wow. He ended up with 29.6 fantasy points.
Wow.
He his projection by 315%. And I think that was probably my favorite pick of the season. Coming into week 5, I think that's when we gained a lot of followers. I think that Sunday night when you posted the reaction video of getting all those right, because that was the week 5. I did Madison when Cook didn't play. Madison beat his projection by a lot. CD Lamb beat his projection, and then Toney. So I think a lot of people, we gained like 15,000 followers that day on TikTok. So it was just an awesome pick.
I think that video hit 1 million. I'm pretty sure it hit 1 million.
Yeah, it was definitely close to that.
Yeah. And, even the Giants didn't even know they had Toney on their team at that point. They kind of there were so many injuries, and they're like,
yeah,
oh, I kind of forgot we drafted this guy. Maybe he's good. And then they use him, and absolutely filthy. He had a great game. Unfortunate that was his best game for the whole season.
Yeah, it was like a kind of like a one-hit wonder type thing. Like he just was not the same ever since then.
It really was, it sucks to see. But, the Giants, they're going to be getting a new coach. Hopefully they'll implement him into the offense a lot more than Jason Garrett did. Right. Next one, highest scoring weekly pick. Now, I could tell you this without even looking at our notes because you used him against me in the playoffs, and it disappoints me, and I'm going to definitely pick him next year just so you can't have him. So who was it?
The highest scoring weekly pick of the season was one of my number 1 weekly picks in week 16, the fantasy championship for most of you. It was T. Higgins. He was projected 15.05 fantasy points. He ended up with 43.4 fantasy points, beat his projection by 288%, and had his best game of his career. And yeah, he was my number 1 weekly pick that week. And yeah, I did pick him up off the waiver wire in our league, and I did play him against you, Jared. So, and I stacked him with Burrow that week. So yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, not only did you beat me, but I think it was, a 30-point differential. So I had no shot at all. And what sucked, and we talked about this, is my Thursday and Saturday players that week did so well. And I'm like, oh, dude, I'm going to win. And you had George Kittle. He got like 4 points. I'm projected like 69, 70% to win. And I'm like, oh, this is great. This is the best feeling.
Yeah.
1 o'clock games hit, done. Absolutely done.
Yeah. Within 3 hours, done. Season's over.
Season's over. So yeah, T. Higgins, you're on my team next year. Maybe I'll come up with a fantasy football name for T. Higgins, and that'll be my new team name.
Oh, yeah.
This year was Lights Kamara action,
Mm-hmm.
and I traded him in like week 3 to you. So
Yeah.
I was not faithful at all.
Yeah.
All right, next award, worst weekly pick. Here you go. Everyone asks, show the picks that didn't do well. Well, here it is right here. Your worst weekly pick, lowest scoring weekly pick all season, and lowest percentage of projection. So, who was it?
It was the same guy that was the best weekly pick of the season, is the worst weekly pick of the season. It's Kadarius Toney. And it was such a bad pick by me. It was week 9. The Giants were playing the Raiders. And I feel like the Giants were going to feature Toney in the passing attack. They instead decided to run the ball a lot. Toney only had 2 targets in the whole game, only had 1 catch for 7 yards. Projected 14.18, only got 1.7 points. He was my number 1 weekly pick that week, my only miss on number 1 weekly pick all season. And he only had 12% of his projection. And people were very, very mad at me that week. And I was pretty mad at myself as well.
Yeah, that one was, that's when you stay off TikTok for a while.
Yeah, that's when you just take a few days off and just reflect.
I mean, that one, every single comment, when I tell you every single one I meet it, every comment was Kadarius. Great pick. Kadarius Toney, great pick.
Good job. Good. You're really good, huh?
Yeah, you're really good at this. Like, oh, it was brutal.
And the thing is, like a lot of people see the Giants flag behind me, and I wear Giants shirt. But Jared, like I'm not a biased person. Like when it comes to fantasy picks, like I tell you, like I wasn't picking Toney because I liked him. I really thought he was going to have a good game, and I really did get that wrong. I was just completely wrong about that. But I bounced back the next week. In week 10, I picked CeeDee Lamb as my number 1 weekly pick. And at that time, he wasn't really like the high profile player he is now. He was good, but that week he had 28.6 fantasy points. So I did at least come back with a good pick the next week.
Yeah. The reason everyone hated Toney is because it was 1.7. So it was like,
yeah, it's like if you had him, like you basically lost.
Yeah, you just were better off not playing anybody. It's like, like if
literally
you got, like,
anybody else would have been better.
We've had players get like 5 points and like 8 points and like single digits. And, people don't get too mad because, that's fine if you're in a 12 or like 16 league. Like that's like 8 is respectable, but like 1.7, it's like, it really is just like,
that just destroys your team. Yeah.
Yeah. So next on the list, best must sit player. Pick that scored the lowest percentage of projected points. Who was that?
So the best must sit of the season was actually Devonte Parker in week 16, the championship. He actually was projected 11.19 fantasy points, and he ended up with 0 fantasy points. So safe to say, and he did not get injured. He did not come out of the game. He played the whole game. Marshawn Lattimore was on him, which is one of the reasons why I picked him. And they played the Saints, and he ended up with 0 points that game. He had, I think, a couple targets, didn't catch any of them, just wasn't part of the game plan. So it turned out to be a good must-sit pick.
You must know the offensive coordinator or something told him to not throw to him.
Yeah, well, he texted me before the game. He's like, we're just going to be targeting Waddle and Gesicki for the most part. So I'm like, oh, Parker's a pretty safe bet for must sit. He's like, yeah, you could throw him in there.
Yeah, we're not using him. We'll put him in the lineup just as a distraction, but we're not throwing him.
Yeah, and the boldest thing about it, and people probably don't realize, like you realize during the season, but you don't realize after the season. But the boldest part about that is, guess what? You'll never believe this, but the week before that, in week 15, Parker was my number 1 weekly pick. So I had him as against, he played the Jets that week, and he ended up with a touchdown and 16.8 fantasy points. That was when we were at the Giants-Cowboys game. And so in week 15, he was my number 1 weekly pick. And then in week 16, I go ahead and have him as a must sit, and he gets 0 points. So like, that just tells you, I thought that was one of my best moments of the year, was like having a guy as your number 1 weekly pick, and then the next week having him as a must sit is pretty bold. but you can't get caught up in recency. You can't get caught up in, oh, this guy just had a great game against the Jets. Like, he's going to be targeted a lot in this game. No, you have to take each game as it is. Like, momentum, you have to factor in a little bit how a guy's playing. But I just thought the game plan wasn't going to go to Parker, and it turned out to be right.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, there's a lot of players that you picked to have some of their best games, like Michael Pittman. You picked, I think, his best game of the season, correct?
Yeah.
And then the next, 3 to 8 weeks after that, I mean, he was on your must sit list like half the time.
Yeah.
So it's like you pick him to be the best player, and then that's it. It's like you
and then,
knew,
and then people are like, what? I thought he was high on him. Now he's having as a sit.
You never have like a consistent weekly pick, which is good. Like you
Right,
never pick like the same guy. Did you ever pick the same guy more than once? You'd have to look at that.
Not as a number one.
Never as a number one. It was always a new guy.
Yeah, and it hit 93% of the time.
Yeah,
pretty cool.
That's great. Okay, so now from the best to the worst must sit. Pick that beat their projection by the biggest percentage. So I remember this one too. And this one was tough.
This one hurt a lot.
Yeah, this one was tough. And it was a guy that literally just got traded.
Yeah, he got traded a couple weeks before to the Arizona Cardinals, and this was in week 11. I had him as my number 4 must sit, so not super confident that he was a must sit, but I was pretty confident because Colt McCoy was the quarterback for Zach Ertz, but Zach Ertz is the worst must pick or must sit of this season. He played the Seahawks that week. He was projected 11.32 fantasy points. I thought there was no way he was going to beat that.
Yeah, that seems
Colt
high.
McCoy. Yeah, it seems pretty high for Colt McCoy being your quarterback. Like, even 5 catches for 50 yards, I would have been right. But he ended up with 28.8 fantasy points. He got 254% of his projection. He would have been better as a weekly pick that week. That was just such a bad pick by me. And, I know I remember making a video for TikTok using that Interstellar clip, just like looking through the window and being like me telling people to sit Zach Ertz this morning and then like him going off. That was tough. A lot of people did not like me for that.
A lot of times it's really funny because you pick a total of usually 8 players, 4 and 4 for the weekly pick, 4 for the must sit. And yet none of them like they always make headlines, whether it's getting 0 points or your must sit goes off for 28 points.
Yeah.
They're always like the main focus of the week.
Exactly.
Somehow.
It's so crazy how it works.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's almost like you could just flip the list at like one of the weeks. If you flipped your must sit list to weekly pick, then you would have been looking like a genius.
Yeah, there was that one week, I think.
You should have just been the titles I got mixed up, actually. These were...
Yeah, I meant to write weekly. I don't know. I must have just got that wrong.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's so interesting because that week in week 11, listen to my must sits that week. It was Michael Pittman. He was projected 14 points. He got 4. So that was great. Like, I hit on that. He did shit. And then McLaurin was my second must sit. He was projected 16. He ended up with 21. He had like a 40-yard touchdown. So then he went off. And then my next one was I think it was Nico Collins. And I think I had him because Cooks was out. So I think a lot of people were hyping Nico Collins, but I said sit him. He only ended up with 3.6. And then I had Ertz, who went off. So it's like that's a perfect week where like either they do really bad, like under 5 points, or sometimes they just go off.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy. It's crazy. Moving on to our next award. And this is a player that you knew the most, a player that you could literally read like a book and be like, yep, this guy's going to have his best week. This guy's going to have his worst week. This guy's not going to do well. Oh, this week he's going to do well. We talked about a lot of different players. So let's list some out. The first one, Michael Pittman, obviously, we talked about before. You picked him with the best week in the weekly pick. And then consistently you were picking him for the must sit, and he did not perform at all.
Yeah, so I was 1 for 1 when he was a weekly pick, which was just that once when he had 30.6 fantasy points. That was his best game of the season. And then I was 2 for 2 when I chose him as a must sit. And And one of them was his worst game of the season. He had 4.3 fantasy points in week 11, which was his worst game of the season. So I basically knew when Pittman was on my weekly pick, you had to have him in. And when he was on my must sit, you had to have him out.
All right, next one, Devonte Parker. As we just said, you picked him in the must sit. You got 0. But what else?
Yeah, so 1-for-1 when a weekly pick, like I mentioned, 16.8 points, and then 2-for-2 when he was a must sit. And when he was a must sit, he averaged 1.6 fantasy points, which is
Oh my God.
pretty crazy. So if Parker's on my must sit, you better just start anybody else over him.
Yes. And then the next one, Brandon Cooks. Now, you can say your stats first, and then I'll kind of I have a similarity between all these 3 players.
Okay, so Cooks, he was a 1-for-1 when he was a weekly pick. He got 19.6 points when he was a weekly pick, and then 2-for-2 I went when he was a must sit, and when he was a must sit, he averaged 5.5 fantasy points.
Wow. And okay, so my thing here, Brandon Cooks, he had Davis Mills for the most part, Tyrod Taylor for some games, Pittman, Carson Wentz, Parker, he had Tua. Aren't very proven quarterbacks. Does that play into it, or are you strictly looking at like the matchup between receiver and cornerback?
No, definitely that's part of it. You definitely have to look at all the factors in the game, and one of them is the quarterback. And like you mentioned, the 3 guys you mentioned are pretty inconsistent quarterbacks. I can't remember Wentz and Tua and Mills being all that consistent this year. So that definitely plays into it, for sure.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I remember, Cooks had his best week with Tyrod at quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
And then, Davis Mills played, and then Tyrod ended up coming back. And I don't remember specifically, but people were all like, oh, he was really good with Tyrod, so we're going to put him in, regardless of matchup, whatever Tyrod likes to target Cooks.
Right.
So, all right, next, we're going to do best week statistically. So, in total, we're going to do when you got the most weekly picks and must sits right combined. So what week was that?
So there was one week that I went 3-for-4 on weekly picks and 3-for-3 on must sits, and that was week 13. So that was
close to perfect.
So dang. Close. That was the week that, and I kind of knew I probably wouldn't get it perfect because I had 3 weekly picks, got 3 out of the 4, but the 4th weekly pick was Rex Burkhead. So that was a guy I remember coming on the live, and Burkhead wasn't a must start. I was just saying, if you're looking for a deeper running back, Burkhead could go off, and he only ended up with 5.5 fantasy points that week. But I think it was the week after that he ended up going for 29. So yep, a week early sometimes, but that's how it goes. And then my must sits, I had Gaskin, DeAndre Hopkins, and James Robinson, and they all underperformed pretty significantly.
Yeah, that happens so many times. So many times you pick players like a week early. Sometimes the time machine, it's hard to see the dates when you go back. So it's hard to like decipher, is it this week or is it next week Burkhead was going to go off? And you're like, I think it was this week. Next week.
Yeah, just wrong about it sometimes. I mean,
technically you were right, but we'll let it slide.
Yeah.
From the best week to the worst week statistically, which one was that?
So that was week 6. I only went 1-for-3 on my weekly picks, and I only went 1-for-3 on my must sits that week. So my weekly picks, actually, Joe Mixon was my number 1 weekly pick. He was, I guess, a decently high profile player at the time, had 26 fantasy points, but I took a chance on Javonte Williams and Chuba Hubbard, 2 pretty low running backs, and neither of them overperformed. And then my must sits, Amari Cooper, I got right. He was my number 1 must sit, only got 10 points. He was projected 17. And then Josh Jacobs and Cortland Sutton as must sits, they both overperformed. So combined, I only went 2 out of 6, which is basically like 30% for the week. So that was my worst week of the season.
Some guys you predicted to go off, like Javonte Williams, you were predicting him and it was just like a little too early. Like you were expecting him to make that jump.
I know at
with
some
the first
point,
reps.
Right. At some point I knew, because a lot of people, if you guys saw me talking about him, I think twice he was a weekly pick and he didn't hit either of those times. It was only until Melvin Gordon actually didn't play that he went off. But you knew the whole time that Javonte Williams was going to break out at some point, because if you looked at yards per carry, he was leading Melvin Gordon in almost every single game, but they would still split carries. So you knew it was only a matter of time before he broke out, but I just wasn't able to hit it right on the point. And when it did come for that week that Gordon was out, Trevante Williams was so overhyped that it wasn't worth me picking him as a weekly pick because it was just so obvious that he was going to do well.
Right. All right. So now we're going to the best streak. So this was when you had the hottest streak as far as picks go. So which weeks were that? It looks like it's from week 3 to week 8.
Yeah, so we did talk about weeks 12 and on just before, and I think that's an honorable mention here is that from three weeks from week 12 to week 14, my weekly picks went 9 for 12, which is pretty good. And like I said, I was 74% on weekly picks in the last 7 weeks of the season. So finishing off the season strong. But basically, yeah, from week 3 to week 8, it was crazy. My number one pick went on a hot streak. And for 6 straight weeks, my number one weekly pick beat their projection. All 6 scored touchdowns. And from week 5 to week 8, which is 4 weeks, my number one weekly pick was week 5, Alexander Mattison scored 26.3. Then Joe Mixon scored 26.3. Then Mike Evans had 3 touchdowns and scored 31.6 against the Bears. And then Michael Pittman, 30.6 against the Titans. And they all scored touchdowns, total of 7 touchdowns between the 4 guys, and they all had their best week of the season. So for 4 straight weeks, my number one pick, I predicted them to have their best game of the season up until that point. And yeah, I think that was probably one of the best streaks that I had this whole season.
Wow. And we did talk about week 12, but you say honorable mention to week 12 to week 14. That was 3 weeks when you went 9 for 12 on the weekly picks.
Right.
That's insane. Wow. Let's move on to end off the award show. Your favorite moments from the fantasy football picks so far. This is season 2021 to 2022. This is our second season doing it. Basically your first doing it like full time like this, like
right.
Very in-depth research. But season 2, 2021, 2022, some of your favorite moments, some of your favorite picks.
So one of my favorite moments was definitely the Kadarius Toney week, which was week 5. And I think before that, I remember going live on TikTok in week 1. And I think we were getting like 80 viewers consistently on the live. And I was like, all right, that's pretty good for week 1. Then week 2, I come on, there was like 100 people. And I remember texting you afterwards. I'm like, dude, we just break 100 people were in my live. Like, that's crazy. And then week 3, it like jumped. And I think week 5 was the big jump. Once week 5 happened, I think in week 6, I just went like over like 4,000 people or something at once, which was insane to me. But week 5, Dalvin Cook didn't play. Alexander Mattison was making his first start of the season. I said, you need to have him in your lineup. He's my number one weekly pick. He ended up with 26 fantasy points. Then I had CeeDee Lamb, who ended up with 19 fantasy points. Beat his projection, and then obviously Kadarius Toney, my best weekly pick of the season. So I went 3 for 3 on weekly picks, and I remember you posting the reaction video, and people were like, "Oh shoot, what the heck? Like, this guy just predicted 3 players, and not only that, but like a backup player in Madison and a guy that nobody really knows, Kadarius Toney, who hasn't been involved. You just predicted him to go off." And then I think that was just one of my favorite moments, just watching the comments roll in and everybody DM me like that Sunday night and throughout the next week was just so much fun. And just see our follower count go up and see a lot more people joining the live and just spending time interacting with us was a lot of fun.
The live was, you went from like, I don't know, 100, 200 to like 5,000, like an insane amount of people. Like, I remember you can put in the bio, you can put the like register for this live. And the first one that you did, I mean, we had like our personal ones, we like registered to like make sure when people looked at it, they saw that there were people registered for it.
Yeah.
And now like when you put it up, it's like minimum 500, 600 people registered for it.
Which is insane to me that like I think later in the season, it was like 800 and 900 people. They want to get notified when I go live. Like they want their phone to tell them, oh, Dorm Debate's going live. Like that's
Mhm.
crazy to me. 900 different people like want to like join my live and like see what I have to say. It's crazy, but I love it. I love spending time with everybody, seeing the chats come in, seeing how everybody's doing, and just enjoying the Sunday with everybody.
It's great. The way you put it together, it's not just like a normal live, it's more like a show. So
Right.
it's like a 30 to 45-minute show and like an event that people have to tune in for every Sunday. And we don't go live that often.
Right.
So when you go live, everyone tunes in. So it's great to see. Another favorite moment that you have on here is week 12 with Hilliard. And I remember that I started Hilliard in my other league, my 12 man, and I was like middle of the pack. So if I lost a couple, I could drop out of the playoffs. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to follow John's picks. I'm going to become a Dorm Debate fan, and I'm going to follow his picks from this point on to the playoffs. And one of the first picks that I could pick up, because this league was 12 man, but everyone picked up everybody. And Hilliard was my first like pickup at running back. And I remember I benched, I think it was Melvin Gordon or some big name guy. I benched over him, and you know, the whole game it was, here or there. He's getting touches, but not really breaking one out. And then I think third quarter or something, or fourth quarter, he breaks out this long, like 60-yard run.
Yeah.
And like I was like having a conversation with my dad, and I like glance over and he's just running. I'm like, oh, it's Hilliard. No way. So like on top of me having him in my league in the lineup, I was like, that's John's pick. Of course.
Yeah.
This is awesome. Everyone's gonna be so happy because out of that 4 picks, like who people pick up the most because he's like the least rostered.
Yeah.
So a lot of times you tell me like, all right, this guy, like he needs to hit because
Right.
I know a lot of people have him rostered.
Yeah. And that week it was Hilliard because I remember a lot of people being like, I need like a deep running back. And you were telling me, I think that week, like, these running backs, like there's a lot of players getting hurt. Like I need a running back I could just pick up and put in that could
Yeah.
go off. And that was why it was one of my favorite moments, is because I'm like, all right, guys, pick up Dontrell Hilliard. And I remember saying it on my live and people were like, what the heck? Who's this guy Hilliard? And I remember you telling me, and never heard of this guy before until he was on my board. So it was so fun to see that happen. He broke off 60-yard run. He was projected 10 points, ended up with 18 points. So that was so fun to see that happen. And people be like, oh my gosh, what a great pick. And I remember people DMing me saying in the comments like, oh, wow, you nailed that Hilliard pick. And then the crazy part is that we come on this fantasy podcast in week 12, like in between week 12 and week 13. And I remember you being like, oh, wow, that was a great pick with Hilliard. Like I literally just followed your advice. I'm going to be a Dorm Debate fan. Like I need your advice, like that helped me. And I remember being like, all right, well, what do you need for this week? And I remember you saying, well, I need a wide receiver. Like what wide receiver can I pick up this week? So I'm like, I already had done some research and I'm like, all right, who's available in your league? And you listed off some guys.
Oh
And
yeah.
one of the guys you listed was Russell Gage. And I think you listed 10 guys. So I'm like, okay, I think I might have a guy that's available that could get you a lot of points. And you're like, and I remember you saying on the podcast, you're like, see guys, he doesn't even tell me. So like,
Yeah, you didn't.
And I didn't tell you. So literally I go on Sunday and I text you before I go live. I'm like, you ready to see who you need to pick up and put in for wide receiver? And I remember you being like, yeah, I'm ready. So I go on and I say Russell Gage is a weekly pick. And it was just so perfect because he played, I forget who he played that week, but he was only projected 11.79 fantasy points. He ended up with 22 fantasy points. And it was just like, that was like, wow, this guy must be from the future. Like he literally chooses Hilliard. And then like he comes on the podcast and says, oh, I think I have a guy, but you're going to have to wait until Sunday to find out. And then he goes ahead and chooses a guy that's available in most leagues. And then that guy goes off. Like that was probably one of my favorite moments, just being able to like do two things in a row, like deep guys that could go off, and they did.
Yeah, back-to-back weeks I put him in my lineup. I think I went, I remember it was like, I think I ended the season with like 6 wins. Nah, I forget what my record was, but it was like way over 500. I think it was like 3 games over 500 when I started listening to you, because I had Robert Woods get injured and I had Melvin Gordon get injured in the middle of the year. So I released him. So I just had a lot of holes. Kamara got injured. So
Mhm.
like my lineup went from like being the top 3 to now being like mid pack, and I need to make moves every single week to get
Right.
by. I was going to mention one thing. I forgot what it was. The one week that I don't listen to you, which was a week that I won, but it was the 5th place game. It was against
Yeah.
my brother, and I don't know who I started in place.
It was, I'm pretty sure
Stevenson.
you started Cordero Patterson
Oh yeah, it was
because
Cordell
remember,
Patterson. Yeah.
because I texted you on Thursday and I was like, is Boston Scott? I think I just randomly texted you. I was like, is Boston Scott available in your league? And you're like, yeah. I'm like, and you're like, why? Because Miles Sanders was going to be out. But Jordan Howard was like questionable. And they were like, oh, we think Jordan Howard might play, he might not. So I'm like, pick up Boston Scott. You're like, but Jordan Howard probably is going to play, right? Even though
Yeah.
Sanders is out. And I'm like, no, I think he might be a really good option. You're like over Cordero. And I'm like, yeah.
And so what happened was I had Cordero and I had Dare Ogumbawale, and
Oh yeah.
that was the guy that I went with. And I had Scott in my lineup for the longest time until like the very, very end. And I took Boston Scott out, and of course Boston Scott had like 20 something points.
Yeah.
And Dare did well. I think he had 13.
Yeah.
That wasn't it's not a PPR league, it's a half PPR, but he had like a late receiving touchdown
Hmm.
to get me by. But like when I don't follow your advice, of course, then the guy like I don't know. Sometimes I just want to like test you. So like I take the guy and I'm like, he did say Boston Scott, but I'm gonna go with the other guy. And then of course,
Yeah.
because
I mean,
he
yeah,
was
you could be
projected,
right.
Boston Scott, I think was projected like 8.
Yeah.
Like it did not change the whole week. So I'm like,
Right.
I think Howard's gonna get more touches, and of
Right.
course he goes off. So
Yeah, I mean, you could be right. I'm not, like I said, I'm not right all the time, and you could see by my percentages. So yeah,
yeah,
it was honestly a decent choice to go against me. Ogumbawale, like the bet was he was going to get more touches because James Robinson was out.
yeah,
So it wasn't all that bad of a pick.
yeah. I ended up winning. So, and then your last favorite moment was popular guy on Dorm Day podcast recently, Jarvis Lane.
Yeah, we just talked about him a couple weeks ago. You were pretty adamant that he needs to be moved off the Browns, and
Yes,
then we went back, and you were like, he only has one receiving touchdown the whole season, and I'm like,
one.
wait, yeah, he was my weekly pick that week that he had his touchdown. So like the one week that he has a touchdown the whole season, I'd like predicted it, which is crazy. At that point, I didn't even know he had 0 touchdowns. I don't think. Maybe I did, but I remember him getting a touchdown in the first half. All my weekly picks had a touchdown within the first half of that week. And it was just that was crazy to me that I predicted the only touchdown of his season.
Well, up until week
Up until week
18,
18.
then he got a lucky one, or
Yeah.
what did he get, 2
I
or
think
just
I
one?
don't even know. I think he just had one, but the defender slipped at the 5 yard line and he walked in.
If you didn't give him, the powers, if you didn't pick him, then he wouldn't have gotten the touchdown. He would have went
Yeah.
the whole season with 0 touchdowns.
Okay. Next year, I'm not going to pick him at all. Let's see if he gets 0.
You never picked Kenny Galladay. So the no touchdowns for
Oh,
Kenny Galladay was probably because you didn't pick him.
oh, okay. So next year I'll pick him at least once. So I'll let him get at least one next year.
Yeah, give him a shot. Give him a
Okay.
chance. Maybe the 3rd place spot, not the number 1 pick.
Okay. Not number 1 weekly pick, but maybe number 3.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. We're ending off the award show, and now we're going into some recap of an episode that we had around week 10 mid-season, well, mid-fantasy season, was the fantasy football playoff episode. And that was one where you went through quarterbacks, receivers, running backs, tight ends, defense. You went through a whole list of players, defenses that you thought when the time came for the playoffs that these guys had the best matchups, that you should trade for these players, and that they would pay dividends in the playoffs. So let's take a look at some of your predictions that were right and were wrong.
Right. Yeah. I'm just going to quickly go through, don't not spend too much time on this, but basically my number one quarterback for the playoffs. And like Jared said, I had this fantasy playoff special, I think week 10 or week 11. So guys that I thought you should trade for in preparation for the fantasy playoffs, because you want to make sure that if you're going to get there, that you're going to win when you get there. So my number one quarterback was Joe Burrow. We know how that ended out. He just
Yep.
went off the last 2 weeks, week 16 and 17. And then the other quarterbacks I liked, like did decent, like Herbert, Brady, Rogers, and Kyler. They all did decent. But then my dislike was Lamar Jackson, who didn't even play in the fantasy football like 16 and 17. So I guess I got it right. Like you should have picked a different quarterback, but also it was kind of lucky. And then Kirk Cousins in week 16 didn't beat his projection against the Rams. He only had 16 fantasy points. And then in the pack against the Packers in week 17, he didn't play due to COVID. So a little luck, I guess, there, but still, I guess, right. And then with the running backs, I had Swift, Montgomery, Mixon, Henderson, and Fournette, which is kind of tough because Henderson was hurt those weeks. So was Fournette and so was Swift. So it's kind of tough with the running backs. I did say I didn't like Nick Chubb or Josh Jacobs, so I'm going to check their stats first. I remember Chubb having a good game in week 16 against the Packers. He actually had 27 points, so I was wrong about that. But then in the championship week 17, he only had 5.8 fantasy points. So I was pretty right about that. And then Josh Jacobs, he had 11 points in week 16. So I guess I got that right, but then 18 points in week 17. So just over his projection there. And then as far as the wide receivers, this was pretty interesting. Deebo Samuel, obviously I told Jared, I remember I extended that trade offer to you before going on the podcast. So
Oh,
Deebo, I think ended up
multiple trade offers.
multiple. Yep. So trying to get him on my fantasy team. And then my number two guy was actually Amari Cooper, who had 21.5 points in week 16 and then only 11 in week 17 against the Cardinals. And then DeAndre Hopkins, who was hurt. But then the fourth guy was actually DK Metcalf. And a lot of you were probably surprised by that because Russ and DK were just not on the same page. But actually in week 16, he got 12.1 fantasy points, so not great. But then in week 17, he ended up with 30.9 fantasy points, had his best game of the season. So hopefully you guys were able to get him on your team. And then I disliked Brandon Cooks and Justin Jefferson. So Cooks actually had a good week 16. He was one of my picks that week. He played, or week 16, he didn't play. So I guess I was right about that. But then week 17 against the 49ers, he was one of my picks at 19.6 points. So I guess I was right one week and wrong the next week for that. And then Justin Jefferson, I remember making that TikTok. I don't know if you remember, but remember it was like I think it was the pacer, not the pacer test, but like the pull-up challenge, like they not challenge, but thing they do in school where it was like up, down.
Yeah. The
So I
fitness
did that
Grandmasia
for,
test.
yeah, I did that for like that trendy video for that and saying that DK Metcalf was trending up for the playoffs and Jefferson was trending down. And obviously everybody destroyed me for that because everybody liked Jefferson because he was playing so well at that point and DK wasn't. But Jefferson in week 16 had 19.6 fantasy points. So actually he did have a decent game, projected 19.06. So he beat his projection. But then in week 17 against the Packers, he only had 11.8 fantasy points, partly because of the weather, partly because Kirk Cousins wasn't playing. But either way, I think Metcalf combined and averaged more points in the fantasy playoffs than Jefferson. So that was pretty good. And then tight ends also, I'm probably not going to really say much here because Hawkinson was injured. Logan Thomas was injured. Those were two of my top three likes. And then as far as defenses, nothing too crazy. I said I like the Bucks, Seahawks, Chargers, and Saints. I don't think any of them were that great. I should have picked defenses that were playing against the Giants because the Bears and the Washington football team both did great in their respective game against the Giants. So nothing too crazy about the defenses or tight ends. I would think I was either probably just around okay for those, but it was just the wide receivers, quarterbacks I hit with Burrow. So that was about it for that. Hopefully do it again next year and hopefully have some more success.
It's so tough because I'm pretty sure we did it around week 10. So it's hard to predict when there's so many factors like COVID and other injuries
Right.
like Lamar Jackson that kind of make it a lot more difficult than any other season because you had guys like Tyreek Hill getting COVID and then the next week he didn't play as well. Like I think after he came back from COVID, he had like 4 or 5. And it's like, well, okay, now is Tyreek Hill a good option now for the playoffs, and he ended
Right.
up not being. He was really bad.
Yeah.
And it was like, was that because of COVID? Like, how would you predict that? So
It is very tough to predict that, but
yeah.
got some things right, got some things wrong.
Yep. And we're gonna go through TikTok, because on TikTok, obviously, you post a lot of preseason videos. Back when we had, I don't know, 30K, 20K, something like that.
Yeah.
So a lot of people may not have even seen these videos.
Yeah.
But the first one, Jamar Chase, I remember preseason, everyone was talking about his drops, and he would drop all these passes in preseason. And you're like, this guy, I'm drafting him in every league or whatever. And you're like, this guy's going to be good. This guy's going to be great. And everyone in the comments just absolutely roasted you. You're like, have you not seen his last couple games? He drops everything. What are you
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah, people roasted me, and I posted, like you said, not a lot of people probably saw these because we didn't have that many followers, and really didn't make a big deal. We didn't have these fantasy football shows at that point, but next season we're going to have these in August, so preparing people for the draft, giving my draft advice, but I really didn't like put that much emphasis because we didn't really have many followers at that point, and we kind of like fantasy we hadn't done since like December of the season before. So like a lot of people didn't know us for fantasy. So people were like, I was trying to gain credibility by giving draft advice. Like people probably weren't going to trust me. So I didn't really put that much weight into it. But yeah, I posted 4 videos. I think one of them was breakout players. One of them was who's the deceiver in your fantasy draft. One of them was players I'm drafting in all my leagues. And then one of them was the biggest sleepers for this season. So I posted 4 videos. And like you said, one of them, the players I'm drafting in all my leagues, Jamar Chase was one of the guys I had on there. And like you said, people just destroyed me. They were like, have you not seen his preseason and his training camp? He's like horrible. He's not shining. He's not doing good. And I didn't even respond to those comments because I did draft him on all my fantasy teams and it turned out to be right. But I did get a couple things wrong. I think I said Adam Thielen I was drafting in all my leagues. He did have a good start to the season, but then got hurt and kind of fell off a little bit. But then I think the most impressive one, and I think I just told you before we got on the show, I don't know if you knew, and I didn't really know until recently. I made a video in the preseason, and you guys, if you guys are listening still at this point, go back to our TikTok, scroll all the way down, go to our preseason, and one of the videos with the colored lights and my flag and glasses and stuff, one of the videos was biggest sleepers in fantasy this season. And you'll never guess who my number 1 sleeper was. It was Amon-Ra St. Brown. And for the first half of the season, this guy like was a nobody. Like I literally forgot that he was my biggest sleeper this season. I literally completely forgot. And I think I that would be cool if I like reacted to the video on TikTok. I might do that, but having him, he was literally like the playoff MVP for a lot of people, had over 20 fantasy points each of the last like 4 or 5 weeks. He was just a target monster, scored touchdowns like crazy, just getting everything, focal point of that offense. And because their defense was so bad, they had to throw it to him. So I think that was really impressive. While I got a couple other things wrong in those sleeper videos, I think that was the only guy I really hit on, but it was a pretty big hit. I didn't actually get him on any of my fantasy teams, which stinks. I didn't listen to my own advice, but that was crazy to see happen towards the end of the season.
That is amazing. I will say, as we wrap up this episode, that's our longest one yet, I believe. I did pry Jamar Chase out of you.
You did.
And I will proudly say that I won that trade.
No, you did, because if I didn't make that trade, well, the trade was I give you Kamara, or no, I give you Chase, you give me Kamara.
Straight up.
And if I didn't do that trade, I would have won our league. Jonathan ended up beating me by like 5 points in the last week. But if I had Jamar Chase that week, I would have beat him.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And I didn't have him because I had Kamara, and Kamara had 21 points that week, but I would rather have Chase's 59 or whatever he had. So if I didn't make that trade, I would have won the league, which I just didn't think Chase. How could you predict Chase to have that big of a week? It was just crazy.
Whoa. Dude, Jonathan would have been pissed.
Dude, Jonathan has no idea. He's like, he won the championship, but he has no idea that one trade was the difference.
Oh, if I knew that week, like if I knew that the chain reaction. Like this trade is gonna lose you the playoffs.
Yeah.
The most important player in the championship.
I,
I would say anybody who had Chase definitely won. I know the guy that had Chase in our league in my 12 man, he won because of
yeah.
Chase. Like there was no, if you had Chase, it was over.
It was almost impossible to overcome it if you were playing against him.
In a 12, 15, 16 man league or whatever. It's impossible. But wow. Yeah, I mean, it was fun. I mean, I was surprised you let him go because you loved watching him play.
Oh, I loved him. And when I said that trade, I think because I needed running backs at that point, because I think I had Zeke and Dalvin Cook and they were both banged up. So I'm like, all right, I'll give you Chase because I had so many receivers. I'm like, I'll give you Chase for Kamara. You're like, really? I'm like, yeah. And then you're like, send it. So I sent it. And then a minute later you accept it because I did like Chase. I loved watching him, but he had such good production, and I knew T. Higgins was coming back, and I'm like, T. Higgins is going to take a lot of targets away, but nobody knows that yet. So I ended up being right. Like T. Higgins did have a bunch of good weeks, but I ended up being wrong when it mattered, which was the championship.
That's all right. Let Jonathan have it this year.
Yeah, he needs it. And honestly, he would have been very let down if he lost. And I know fantasy is not about winning the championship. That's fun, but I enjoyed making those trades with you and just talking about trades and stuff. So that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I like having more trade scenarios. Like for our league, which is 6 man, there's not a lot of trades. It's kind of like who you draft, and then the waivers. There's so many good players that there's not a real need to do a crazy trade.
Yeah.
But I traded, Kamara for Chase. Then I traded Mike Williams for Kyle Pitts, Kyle Pitts was a decent tight end, but I had Mark Andrews. So I barely started him.
Yeah.
So it was a good season overall. I would say this is a successful season for Dorm Debate, successful season for fantasy in general. I mean, last year, the way it went with COVID, it was a very strange year, but this year it seemed like everything was back to normal. I mean, we went to a football game. The fans were back. Like it was such a great season overall. And to end it with the Raiders Chargers game was like the perfect way to end the regular season. So
yeah, it was a great season for Dorm Debate, and it was so much fun, and I can't wait to do it next season. And before we end, just wanted to say thank you guys for joining my lives if you have, or supporting on the Patreon, or joining and watching these fantasy shows, or watching the Dorm Debate podcast. Just enjoy having you guys around and leaving your comments and seeing what your guys' thoughts are, and seeing you guys in the chat and messaging us. It's just a lot of fun to enjoy and share our love for fantasy football with each other, just talking about the game and talking about who's going to do well. It's so fun. I love it.
Yeah. And thank you. I mean, you, since the season started, put Dorm Debate on your back. I mean, it was, we turned into a full blown fantasy football TikTok. I mean, from the Patreon to Instagram DMs by the thousands, literally by the thousands, and all the TikTok comments, answering everything, doing all the research during the week with the live shows and the TikToks during the week. I mean, you had a lot of work and it paid off. I mean, look at all these correct answers that you had. I mean, better than Matthew Berry this season. So clearly the research that you did paid off, and all the content ideas. You were the one that talked to me about the Patreon. You were the one that started the live show back last year. And like now it being like a big show with 5,000, 6,000 people is just like really great to see. You put a lot of time and effort into the live. So thank you for all your help this season, growing Dorm Debate to what it is.
Of course.
We went from 30K to now 150K, mainly because of you. So,
well, I think you kickstarted it without your fantasy profile videos and graphics. I don't think we would have had the kickstart that we had. So I think you really had the kickstart. So great job.
It was a little boost.
And I can't wait to see what you have up your sleeve for the rookies this upcoming year for fantasy, or for, players that you didn't get to do. I can't wait for August to see what you come up with.
I already got a list, guys. I already have a list of potential names. Yeah, man, especially with Amon-Ra They call him
Oh
Among
my
Us, so
gosh,
that's already
Among
one.
Us, that's going to be one, and that's going to get a lot of views.
Yeah,
I
already
might
got one
use that.
down.
I might draft Among Us. I want Among Us.
Maybe. All right, we're gonna wrap up this episode of John's Fantasy Football Show. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will be back. I'm pretty sure we'll have one next week, maybe. We're gonna try and keep this show going, just talking about. I know the sports betting is now legal in New York, so a lot of people have been asking about like, oh, which players are gonna hit the over, which players are gonna hit the under. So John will still probably give his picks, his favorites for who's gonna have better games than other people, people that won't do well, some teams that will do well. Obviously, not betting advice. This is
Yeah,
just
no.
nothing like that. But this is just like, oh, Jarvis Landry, whatever, he's gonna play well, for example, or oh, Dak's gonna have a good game against 49ers. Just little things like that, but no betting. We're not gonna go into a betting channel, all right? I
No.
said we weren't gonna do fantasy, and we
Yeah, I
turned into
wasn't I
this.
wasn't with you on the fantasy, but I'm with you on the betting. We
All
we
right,
won't
good.
go into a betting. I'm gonna give my advice just as a football fan, just like who I think's gonna do well or not. But like you said, it's not betting advice. Don't take this and just bet
Exactly.
whatever I say because I'm not right all the time. I'm right most of the time, but not all the time. So I don't want you to put any money on what I say because I don't want you to come into my house and get mad at me for losing money.
Yeah, because you lost $100,000 on freaking Kadarius Toney to have
Yeah.
over 10 points.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Well, everybody enjoy the playoffs this week as well. There are a lot of good games, and we get football Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. It's gonna be a great week. Hopefully, you guys enjoy, and we will see you guys next week.